All right, well, my son asked me to look at one of his friend's generators that he uses, this little GP 17500E by Generac, to see what happened to it, because he was using it and then he put it away for a while, and then when he went to fire it back up, it wouldn't start, wouldn't turn over or anything. So I'm going to show you what's really important about these Generac generators, about the fuel supply and the shutoff, because he either forgot to turn the shutoff off when he stored it, or it had a leak in it. But what happened is that it hydrolocked this motor. Normally not too big of a deal, but for this particular motor it is a huge deal. So let's get set up over here and I'll show you why hydrolocking one of these Generacs basically ruins the motor. So this motor is going to have to be took off or replaced, or it might not even be worth it at this point for this generator. But we'll see what happens when you hydrolock one and it actually slips the timing on one of these. Alright, so if we look and see what we got going on here, why it won't start, it actually won't rotate. It'll rotate a little bit, but it won't rotate far. And what's happened is this cylinder, when I took the spark plug out, this cylinder was full of fuel. And it also had a little more oil in it than it's supposed to, so I was wondering why the oil level was higher, but now I know it's because there was fuel in that cylinder, and some of it had gotten down into the oil. But the problem was because that fuel was in that cylinder, when it went to turn over after it was in storage for so long, it hydrolocked that cylinder. Well, normally it would just stop the motor, but let me show you what it did to this particular motor. So if I rotate it, you can see it'll rotate around, and then it gets to a point right there where it won't rotate anymore. Well, you noticed right there at the last, this intake valve dropped down. Well, I'll show you in a second that the piston is on top dead center. So if I rotate the other way, you'll see the valve come back up, and it'll go around, goes a little ways, and then it stops again. Well, it stopped on the other valves on the other cylinder. So let's put a little stick in there and I'll show you that this thing has slip time. It can't really jump time because there's no belt, it's actually gears. I'll show a little schematic up on the screen and you can see that it's actually gear driven. So the only way that it can slip time is if the gear slips on the crank, or if it slips on the cam. Probably slipped on the crank because it came to such an abrupt stop when it was hydrolocked that the cam, the inertia of the cam made it want to keep turning, and it actually slipped the gear on the crankshaft. So if we crank it around here, you'll see my little stick coming up, and I got a little white mark on it to show right there where top dead center is. So if I put my little stick down in there, you can see as it comes up, right when I hit top dead center, right there, this valve starts going down. Boom. And that valve just ran into the cylinder because it's still on top dead center. So what's happened is it slipped time enough that now the valve is impacting the piston. Well, that's as far as it's going to go. So the whole big reason why all this occurred is because the fuel shutoff either wasn't turned off when it was put into storage, or it leaked and let fuel come in. So really important on these Generacs that the way they got that timing gear designed is that it'll slip if it hits a sudden impact like a hydrolock like that, and it basically ruined this motor. The motor has to come completely apart. The back side is where the cam is, so you got to take all of this off, replace that cam gear if the gear slipped, or replace the crank if it slipped on the crank, because now you don't know where the position is. So all that's got to come apart. Poor little motor got wasted simply because it got hydrolocked, and it was because the fuel shutoff wasn't turned off or it was leaking. So considering that the cylinder was full of fuel when the motor was cranked over after it had been stored for a while, and it ran into the fuel, it actually didn't hit the valves. So fortunately, if anything that's fortunate about this situation is that probably the valves aren't bent, probably the little push rods aren't bent, all that stuff is not bent because it actually impacted the fuel is what slipped the timing. So all of this may still be good It just needs a new crank with the timing gear set in the right position again. Then you can put it back together. That'll probably cost you $200–300 for a crank for one of these things. But at least it didn't mess up the top end. Now, if somebody spun it backwards and then tried to crank it again, then that second go, it's going to bend the valve. Because you can see now, the thing that stops the cylinder is that valve right there. As soon as it drops down and we're on top dead center. So, the motor has to come apart either way, but there might be at least a saving grace is that it would only be the crank or the little gear that's on the crank that would have to get took off and put back in place. At least it didn't mess up all the valves and the push rods and all that stuff. Well, alrighty, there you go. One of the important reasons why you got to make sure you turn your fuel shutoff valve off when you store these Generac generators, because you can totally ruin one of these motors. Well, alrighty. Well, thanks for watching.